One of the most common arguments against socialism is that socialism stifles innovation thanks to a lack of competition. But the USSR, at that point the largest socialist country in history, actually offered generous incentives for inventors and employed more scientists than any other country in the world. Inventors would receive numerous medals and financial rewards for creating inventions, and create inventions they did. The USSR created the first functioning nuclear power plant, the Obolinsk nuclear power plant. They created the first mobile phone, the Altai mobile telephone system, nearly a decade before the Nokia cell phone. They also invented the LED screen, the first microwave, the first radio antenna, and the first artificial heart. All of this, along with many more minor inventions, as well as numerous more theoretical contributions in mathematics, nuclear physics, chemistry, and astronomy. And then there is, of course, the space race. Popular media has to this day framed the landing on the moon as the victory of the space race for the US. Of course, this so-called victory is really just an arbitrary, post-facto construct. The US succeeded in achieving one major part of the space race, but the USSR achieved almost every other possible milestone first, from the first satellite in space to the first man in space, to the world's first space station, and, after the space race supposedly ended, the first landings on Venus and Mars. Contrary to the popular belief that the USSR didn't care about the environment, as Stephen Brain argues in Songs of the Forest, it was in fact one of the first governments to actually engage in the sustainable management of its own forest and farmland. The USSR created some of the world's first forestry preserves, and was highly concerned with proper use of the soil through the creation of shelter belts, crop rotation, and the construction of ponds and reservoirs to ensure high sustainable crop yields. There were, of course, issues when it came to science in the Soviet Union. Cooperation with foreign researchers was largely forbidden, which hurt scientific advancement. But this was, of course, thanks in large part to very credible fears of spying from the West. And of course, there was also Lysenko. Trofim Lysenko was a scientist who refused to accept the chromosome theory of heredity usually accepted by modern genetics. Claiming his scientific theories corresponded to Marxism and that they would increase crop yields, he banned the practice and teaching of population genetics and several other related fields of biological research, ruining the careers of several scientists. Lysenko's policies also likely led to millions of deaths from famine both in the USSR and China. Of course, this was not some fundamental problem with the USSR or socialism itself. As shown in terms of the examples provided, focusing just on Lysenko is like if we ignored the countless brilliant creations of American scientists to instead focus on Dr. Oz. It wasn't just in terms of science where the USSR thrived, but also the arts. There was the more abstract constructivism movement, which led to incredibly innovative and startling examples of graphic design, painting, and architecture, and had significant influences on further artistic movements. The USSR also innovated with the art style of socialist realism, an artistic movement which for the first time in history had as its focus the glorification of the common man. Well, usually, anyways. Not to mention how Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein invented the idea of the montage in his film Battleship Potemkin, and directors like Adrian Tarkovsky went on to create many of the most famous, acclaimed, and innovative films of all time. The USSR also had an even more advanced, if not also sometimes disappointing record in regards to its social policies. From 1919, it granted free education from childcare and preschool all the way to a PhD, and under a massive literacy program called Lickbez, or the elimination of illiteracy, literacy skyrocketed from around 20% at the rise of the Bolsheviks in 1917 to 70% by the beginning of World War II. Vast liberties were also granted to women. Divorce for women was legalized, women were encouraged to join the workplace, and more women would go on to be employed in the sciences in the USSR than anywhere else on Earth. Women also played a key role fighting in the front line in World War II, making up around 5% of the overall numbers, where in most other countries women had little to no actual combat role whatsoever. Of course, in practice, it was still harder for women to advance than men in some fields, particularly in the fields of politics. The USSR was also the first place in modern history to allow abortion. but then criminalized it in 1936, before it was legalized again in 1955. The USSR founded the modern idea of the 8-hour workday with the Decree on the Hours of Labor, and with this, general conditions improved drastically for the average worker. It also granted significant democracy to workers to an extent never before seen either, with workers able to run to be a boss of a local workplace, as well as to be voted out by the other workers if they were perceived to not be representing the workers' interests. This didn't mean workers lived in a utopia, but it did mean that workers exercised a greater degree of influence over their conditions than they had at any other time in human history up to that point, and arguably since. Bosses these days can't just be voted out by the workers. You can form unions to advocate for the better conditions, but there are significant obstacles to actually securing any rights with those unions. Common workers were also given more ability to move up the ranks than any other time in history at that point. Almost to a fault, really, as people's actual qualifications were sometimes ignored in comparison to the fact that they came from the working class, such as in the case of Trofim Lysenko. Not a single secretary of the Soviet Union didn't come from humble backgrounds. Joseph Stalin's family lived in poverty. Khrushchev was born to a poor peasant farming family. Leonid Brezhnev was born to a family of working-class steel workers. Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Shevchenko, both Soviet secretaries with very short tenures, were sons of a railway laborer and peasant farmers, respectively. Mikhail Gorbachev, last secretary of the Soviet Union, was also born from a peasant farmer family. These are only a few of countless examples of working-class people getting to high ranks in the Communist Party. Despite the fact that there was a problem with corruption and nepotism, at the same time, if you worked hard, did well in your studies, and so on, then you were probably rewarded for it to some extent. The Soviet Union also granted free healthcare from cradle to grave so long as you were employed, though this policy was only extended to the rural population in 1969. The Soviet healthcare system also severely lacked proper funding, especially in the 1980s. One of the main objectives of the USSR, as Lenin promoted throughout his life, and as Joseph Stalin established in his work Marxism and the National Question, was to reverse a centuries-long process of Russification, or the idea of forcing other ethnicities to accept Russian culture, through the policy of Korenizatsiya, or indigenization in English. As Stalin later said, "Great Russian chauvinism should be kept in check by the Russians themselves for the sake of the larger goal of building socialism. Within the minority nationality areas, new institutions should be organized, giving the state a national character everywhere, built on the use of the nationality languages in government and education, and on the recruitment and promotion of leaders from the ranks of minority groups." Terry Martin, a Harvard historian, called the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics the world's first affirmative action empire. As he writes, with the exception of India, no other multicultural state before or after the USSR took action of equivalent scope in support of the cultural and political rights of ethnic minorities. Minorities were often given preferential treatment in terms of finding job positions. The arts and music of other minority cultures were promoted and developed. Ethnic Russian Communist Party officials were required to learn the local language and culture of the given Soviet republic that they were in. All ethnicities also had the right to use their own language, both in private and public, as well as in correspondence with officials and while giving testimony in court. All nationalities in the Soviet Union were also given the right to education in their own language, though this policy wasn't always successfully implemented from grade school all the way to college, and many second language speakers ended up taking courses in the Russian language at some point, given that that was the most common language by far. Attempts were also made to create alphabets out of all languages in the USSR that didn't have written languages. This was difficult with some languages, however, therefore the Latin alphabet was used for all languages in the Soviet Union without a traditional alphabetical writing system in order to avoid the impression that the policy was an attempt at Russification. All of this is, of course, as much a matter of pragmatism as it is of humanism. What better way to promote harmony than promote the other cultures of your country and not repress them? The main failing of the USSR's treatment of ethnic minorities were, of course, the deportations of various ethnic groups on the largely misguided suspicions of their likelihood
that they might collaborate with the encroaching Nazis during World War II, and in which hundreds of thousands of people died in the process. Russification also did begin to increase during the late 1930s out of suspicion of the disloyalty of certain minorities, increasingly so, to a limited extent, throughout the USSR's existence, even though by any standard the USSR was still very progressive in its treatment of ethnic minorities. One of the things that rather inevitably increased Russification was the simple fact that Russians were the largest ethnicity and language by a good amount, and as such, people would be more likely to meet Russians, become friends with them, marry them, move to cities where Russians were the majority, and so on. The USSR was also the first country in history to establish as part of its official ideology the abolishment of organized religion. This was done, of course, by logical reasoning. Religion was seen by the Bolsheviks as a symbol of the old establishment, as it was deeply embedded within the empire under Tsar Nicholas and was used for a long time to repress and harm and divide. The idea was that by ushering in a new secular age, humanity would grow beyond its superstitious beliefs and become more enlightened than it was in the past. Lenin argued brilliantly that people don't feel the need to actually earn a better life for themselves on Earth, because people would justify the current miserable conditions of their lives now by clinging to the idea of some utopian afterlife. As Lenin paraphrases Marx, religion is opium for the people. This policy of non-tolerance of religion, of course, resulted in the alienation of some of the populace towards the socialist cause. While the ultimate goal of at least some of the Bolsheviks was to completely eradicate religion, it was seen as more of a gradual process. Religion was never made fully illegal in the USSR. People were still allowed to worship within churches and mosques. It was mainly public expression of religion that was outlawed. Yes, many churches were indeed destroyed, and I would argue this was probably a poor choice. You could, secularize the buildings, maybe remove religious iconography, and turn them into community centers. However, overall, I think the restrictions on religious worship really did, to some extent, help instill a socialist mindset in the USSR. In conclusion, while the USSR has been simultaneously portrayed as a conservative, backward, brutish place, as well as a dangerous threat to the rest of the world, not to mention its own people, the USSR was, in fact, to varying extents throughout its history, both socially and scientifically, one of, if not the most advanced country in the entire world. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a helpful comment, and I'll see you next time.